Knightley. The final item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 8651 in the name of James-Dornan on the Cedar-Network. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons now. Since James-Dornan cannot be with us for this debate for very understandable reasons, I therefore call on Sandra White to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to commend my colleague James-Dornan, who unfortunately, due to a family bereavement, cannot be here this evening, and our sympathies are with himself and his family, and obviously for securing this debate. And I must also point out, highlighting the work of Castlemilk Domestic Abuse Project and the Cedar Project, which is in Castlemilk. Presiding Officer, back in November I had the privilege of bringing forward a members' debate to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Glasgow's Women's Aid and the work they do in supporting those suffering from domestic abuse. In the debate, we also had the opportunity to recognise the Children Experiencing Domestic Abuse Recovery, or CEDAR, programme, which, as many of us know, is a therapeutic group work programme that aims to help both women and children to come to terms with the domestic abuse they have experienced or witnessed. Typically, both the children's and mothers' groups work take place at the same time and, importantly, mirror the same aims, such as expressing the emotions surrounding the abuse. This allows the children and their mother to, together, continue to explore, understand and come to terms with what they have suffered and experienced. It's a very powerful model and one that helps to promote empathy and empowerment amongst those attending. And whilst it may seem to many that such an approach is a common sense one, it is actually quite innovative in its delivery. It involves a multi-agency approach, bringing together professionals from a large range of agencies across the public and voluntary sectors. Now, this type of model is also important not only for the way it can transform people's lives, but sadly on a more pragmatic note. At a time when finances are being squeezed, there is more need for this type of multi-agency approach, and I believe that the CEDAR model offers a great opportunity to make a real difference to people's lives, also to tackle the thorny issue of how we continue to support some of the most vulnerable people in our society at these times. The CEDAR Pilot's evaluation report noted that it is contributing to a range of Scottish Government policies, and it represents an opportunity to focus resources in many services. In the previous debate, I noted that Cedar Glasgow had another 2 years of funding from the Big Lottery Fund, and in that debate I said that I hoped the Scottish Government would look to and learn from the Cedar model in its approach to other forms of intervention. In response, the Minister said that a strategy for Scotland to tackle violence against women was being taken forward, and that the strategy will be the very first document in Scotland and will shape the way in which we tackle violence against women in the future. I hope that debates like the one we are having today will help to inform this strategy, and that programmes such as CEDAR will very much be a part of that strategy. Now, I understand the Government will be consulting on it in early 2014, and perhaps in the reply we could tease out more details from the Minister. And I would also like to take a moment to commend the hard work and dedication of those who make much of this work possible, some of whom are in the gallery today, up in the gallery today. And many of them I met earlier today in the Parliament during a drop-in session. And I was very, very impressed by the way all of the groups worked together, from Women's Aid, who I spoke to, Janice, Catherine, Mariam, the Cedar Project, Kirsty and Isla, to the Waves group, and in particular Bessie Anderson, who was the chair of that group, a group that I know James takes a very keen interest in, and one which helps women to take on areas of violent environment, and they actually go at their own pace. It was explained to me that rather than being told to go in certain areas, they take it at their own pace, and it helps women who feel much more comfortable if they wish to move on. And basically, lots of these women gain confidence from it, personal development. They also go into voluntary work and some onto colleges also. And I was very impressed, by the contributions of the people at the drop-in group. Now, I must say my apologies to many of the people I did meet, and I haven't been able to name them, but I'm sure they know who they are in the gallery. And once again, my thanks for all the very much the hard work that they actually do and they carry out on behalf of the people there. Now, from speaking to my colleague James-Dornan, he's been very particularly in praise of the Castlemilk Domestic Abuse Project, through which he learned more of the Cedar Project in his constituency. In the last 3 years alone, the project has helped around 100 people each year, and incredibly, 90% of their clients have gained volunteering positions, as I mentioned earlier, and employment, and this helps them to regain control of their lives. And I think a special thanks must go to all of them, the women who are involved and those who help also. He also learned of the work of Dr Lombard in his research for a debate that Kenneth Gibson, who I believe is contributing to this debate, had on the origins of addiction. And as a result of Dr Lombard's work on how children perceive violence, she noted the need to discuss with school children to help them understand what it meant by a healthy, respectful relationship, in order to break down gender stereotypes, which may unfortunately in the future lead to violence. It's a very fantastic read, and I'm sure if it's available here, I certainly have a copy of it, and I'm sure I'm happy to pass it on to others who don't already have that production. In our debate on the anniversary of Glasgow's Women's Aid, I mentioned the outreach programme in schools that was being undertaken aimed at tackling the issues that Dr Lombard identifies in her publication. Now, I hope that her valuable work alongside the outreach work in schools currently being done will also inform the Scottish Government's future approach to domestic violence. For, as the Minister said in her conclusion at the last debate, it's not only about ending domestic abuse and violence against women, it's also about achieving equality, not just for women, but between men and women in our society. And I hope to look forward to hearing from the other contributions and from the Minister in her summing up. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. I call Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also congratulate James-Dornan for securing the debate and join with Sandra White, expressing my sympathies to himself and his family in their bereavement. And I'm sure James is very grateful, as we all are, to Sandra White for leading this debate in his absence. And I think it's good that this debate can continue in those circumstances. I would also like to pay tribute to the work of the Cedar-Network, working in partnership with children and their mothers, helping mothers support their children through the issues of domestic abuse and using peer support as well. And I don't think we maybe always understand the damage that domestic abuse can have, not only on the relationships between the abuser and their children, but in the relationships of those that are abused in that relationship, where maybe they try and protect each other, and that stops them maybe working with each other in the way they could. And the Cedar-Network seeks to redress this and indeed empower those families to support each other and work their way through it. This debate also recognises the impact that's often overlooked on children and young people of domestic abuse. We very often see that women are abused, and in some cases men, but the majority are women, and we understand how that happens, but we seldom see the impact on young people, their isolation, their anger, their fear, the impact on their self-esteem, their resilience, and this goes on influencing their educational chances, their life chances, and indeed impacts on their future relationships. So I think the damage that domestic abuse does to children cannot be underestimated, and I think the Cedar Project and others recognise that. Domestic abuse, a violent partner can also threaten children, and children and young people can feel that they too may face violence if they don't already do so, because people who can be violent to a partner can also be violent to children, and that can be a bullying relationship where that violence is used against people that are perceived to be less able to stand up to it. Glasgow Women's Aid has been instrumental in setting up the Cedar project in Glasgow with Assist and indeed Help by Children First. And I think Scottish Women's Aid have long recognised the impact on children and young people through domestic abuse, and they have employed for a long period of time children's workers working with young people of all different ages, using play, using social occasions, counselling, to help young people. But I'm also aware that they provide a service for children to access in their own right. There's no need for parental permission. Young people can contact Women's Aid and actually get support and help for themselves. Sometimes their mothers are still in denial about the relationship, about the abuse, and as we all know, those suffering domestic abuse can sometimes be the main people that actually cover that abuse, and children often see this and have to live with that. So being able to access help and support in their own right is hugely important, and that is a service that is offered by Scottish Women's Aid, and we need to keep supporting it. We can't prevent the impact of domestic abuse on children and young people, but what we can do is try and deal with the consequences of it, combat the negative implications this has for young people, give them coping techniques, help them maintain their education, represent them with teachers and the like, and support them through this. But the bottom line is empowerment, and if we empower mothers to support their children, and indeed children to find a way through this themselves, children and young people will have a much better outlook on life because of this, and I commend the work of those organisations who assist in that.
Thank you very much. And I now call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and let me join others in congratulating James in securing this debate, and Sandra for stepping in to make sure that it got off to a good start. The Cedar-Network and the focus of tonight's debate is, of course, the branch in Glasgow, but the motion does make reference to the fact that we're talking about a branch of a wider network. I have met some of the partners of the Cedar-Network in Glasgow on previous occasions, people like Glasgow Women's Aid, and of course Children First, who work right across Scotland. And it's important that Cedar and others have the opportunity of creating links with other organisations that can help. For me, of course, representing as I do a part of Murray constituency, where Cedar has been active for some time, there are important parallels with what's happening in Glasgow and what is happening across the rest of the network in Scotland, and in particular in Murray. But let me just start by making some general remarks. I think the issues we want to think about are what are the sources of violence that affect children. And I think there are a few that we might focus on, in particular mental ill health in the adults that are close to children can be a source of violence. Addictions, particularly drink and severe mind-distorting drugs such as crack cocaine. Relationships that come under stress, particularly through perhaps what I might describe as gratuitous promiscuity on the part of one partner, can lead to violence that involve children. And of course, there's sociopathic conditions, which mean that some parents are not naturally fitted to the role that they find themselves in, and they need the support as well as the children. Now, I'm one of the fortunate majority who's not personally been exposed to this. Having said that, I do remember at some indeterminate point listening at some distance to an argument, and it's the only one I ever remember, between my parents. I've no idea what it was about, but it was sufficiently impressive It wasn't raised voices, it was quite quiet, that I can actually remember it to this day. And when we're talking about much more severe interventions from parents and adults that are affecting children, I can, through that tiny example, my own life, see the effects that may be lifelong with youngsters. So the work of the Cedar-Network is a very important one in tackling the effects of domestic abuse on children. In Murray, we've seen work that they are working with funding from the big lottery, working again with Children First, and they're a partner agency of Murray Domestic Abuse Partnership. And they're doing excellent work through a 12-week therapeutic group work programme for children and young people who've been exposed to domestic abuse. And mothers, too, have the opportunity to attend a group to support their children, because whatever we may think, in general terms, it is often at the mother's door that the remedy lies. I hope that more men step up the mark in their parental responsibilities as well. But the reality is that we deliver a lot if we support the mothers. It is, of course, a group work model. It's adapted from work that came from Canada. It's something that I hope the Minister will acknowledge in her summing up is well worth pursuing. We think that there may be as many as 100,000 children in Scotland living under the shadow of domestic abuse. That tells us how important this debate is, but more fundamentally, how significantly this Parliament should take tent of this issue and the work of the Cedar-Network in Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Before I move on, can I remind members to use full names, please? And can I also just point out that parliamentary rules don't allow gallery guests to applaud, and therefore I must ask our visitors not to do so. Thank you very much. I call Margaret Mitchell, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I commend James-Dornan for tabling today's motion for debate, and Sandra White, who in his absence has opened the debate, explaining what the Cedar-Network does and highlighting the excellent work that it carries out. As Stuart Stevenson said, it is indeed a sobering fact that no fewer than 100,000 children in Scotland are living with domestic abuse. The negative impact of this on young people's attitudes towards violence, and also on their own safety and self-esteem, as Rhoda Grant pointed out in her contribution, most certainly cannot be underestimated. Research carried out by Dr. Nancy Lombard not only confirms these attitudes exist, but goes on to challenge the distorted and grotesque view that somehow male violence towards women is acceptable. Dr. Lambert also advocates early intervention as young as pre-5 to stop these attitudes being perpetuated. For what is not in doubt is that children are the innocent victims who are caught up in and have to live with domestic abuse. And this is a situation which we all seek to eradicate. Currently, concentration on outcomes for offenders tends to overshadow efforts to provide help for those most directly and also indirectly affected by domestic abuse. The Cedar-Network, in carrying out essential work to support these victims in an informal and safe setting, addresses this imbalance. The project began in Fife, Edinburgh and Forth Valley, and now extends into South Lanarkshire and across other parts of Scotland. In South Lanarkshire, the Cedar Project, or to give it its full title, Children Experiencing Domestic Abuse Recovery, is run by Women's Aid and builds on existing Cedar work in the area. This involves mothers and children assessing pre, parallel and post-support programmes, and will benefit 216 children and young people and 120 mothers in South Lanarkshire area over a 3-year period. Violence generally, and this kind in particular, can and does ruin lives, which is why tackling it must be made a priority. This makes sense on a number of levels. as well as the obvious emotional impact of violence in the home, there is additionally, based on a study conducted by the UK Government, the financial costs estimated to be a staggering £4 billion a year. In addition to this, Police Scotland are estimated to spend an average of 6 hours on a domestic abuse incident. So, for a number of reasons, Police Scotland has focused on domestic violence and identified tackling it as a priority. This is certainly to be welcomed, not least because domestic abuse can't be dismissed as merely a row, but instead must be treated as the serious crime that it is known to be. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, this is a short debate, but important issues have been raised, the last one being the necessity to ensure that when effective interventions are identified, funding is available in the longer term. Ideally, a 3-year funding period should become the norm to make sure that these interventions are available.
Thank you very much. And finally, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I begin by thanking James-Dornan for securing this valuable debating time and Sandra White for stepping up to the plate following James' understandable absence. I am pleased to discuss this important topic of domestic abuse and the vital work carried out by the Cedar-Network in helping those affected to rebuild their lives. While domestic abuse is, without doubt, perpetrated upon some men by some women, there is no ignoring the fact that the vast majority of cases involve men abusing their female partners. This violence in the home, the place where they expect to feel safe and secure, can have a hugely traumatic effect on children and lead to a host of problems for them in later life. And it is estimated, as Stuart Stevenson and Margaret Mitchell have already mentioned, that 100,000 children in Scotland live with domestic abuse. Sadly, there will be many that we do not yet know about who live with the trauma of this experience, past and present. Whilst the Scottish Government continues to tackle violence against women and assist those survivors who are recovering from the experience, the work of the Cedar Project and others is invaluable in terms of developing best practice and support and care to those in need. Certainly from the Cedar Evaluation Report and the feedback received from those involved in Cedar projects, the approach they have taken has been highly effective, delivering impressive outcomes and engaging with children and mothers in a way which puts them in control, helping them gain a greater understanding of the domestic abuse they have suffered. Indeed, previously, many children and mothers felt that domestic abuse was somehow their fault, and often children blamed themselves for not doing something to stop it. The Cedar Network, through discussions with peers and group activities, allows both children and mothers to realise they are not the ones in the wrong and helps rebuild their self-esteem. The evaluation report also makes a financial case for Cedar's approach. Their approach to multi-agency working, drawing on the expertise and resources of both the public sector and third sector, has proven to be highly effective. Cedar's focus on early intervention also ensures that the impact on services, including the education system, the criminal justice system, social work departments, the police and the NHS is reduced, as children affected by domestic abuse are less likely to place pressure on them in the long run. I was pleased to note that the Cedar project is now active in my own constituency following its launch at North Ayrshire Council headquarters in May last year. The launch was attended by representatives from a raft of organisations involved with children and families in the area who attended to find out more about the project and were also given information on how to refer families to the project. Attendees were also shown a film presentation which heard directly from children who have already taken part in the project, talking about how important it has been to them and how helpful. I have no doubt that such a presentation would have proved more effective than a briefing or a pamphlet. Locally, the Cedar project has been driven by North Ayrshire's Violence Against Women Partnership and delivered by North Ayrshire Women's Aid, with the project being funded by the Big Lottery Fund for 3 years. From discussions with my local authority colleagues, it is clear that the Cedar project is now integral to North Ayrshire Council's early intervention and prevention strategy, which aims to improve the life chances of children and young people in North Ayrshire, and they are delighted to be working alongside these local organisations towards a common goal. I understand that rural areas, and North Ayrshire has a number of these, have experienced unique challenges including lack of childcare provision, transport issues and low referrals, to name but a few. However, I am aware that Cedar, in partnership with Dr Sarah Skerritt, Director of the Rural Policy Unit at Scotland's Rural College, recently hosted an event to discuss these challenges with representatives from all the Cedar projects which operate in areas defined as rural, in order to explore what needs to change to make the project more effective in a rural context. I also understand that Cedar have been invited to attend the cross-party group on rural policy to further discuss these matters. Presiding Officer, it is clear from members' contributions this evening that the innovative approach being taken by Cedar and the support they offer to mothers and children recovering from their experiences of domestic abuse is invaluable, and I am sure all members in the Scottish Government will continue to offer them the support they need to continue providing their vital services. Thank you.
Many thanks, and I now invite Shona Robertson to respond to the debate. Minister, in around 7 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And firstly, can I also thank James-Dornan for securing this afternoon's debate, and of course Sandra White for taking the debate forward. It's a very important topic because it allows us to reflect on some of the wider issues surrounding domestic abuse. We know of the damaging effects to women who experience domestic abuse. Today we recognise that children and young people in families where there is domestic abuse are victims too. And that is the case whether those children hear the loudest of fights or the quietest of threats, whether they see physical violence inflicted upon their mothers or the aftermath of violence in the form of bruises and broken bones. Indeed, they may not witness physical violence at all, but psychological abuse on women can be just as damaging for children and leave scars just as deep. Even when concerted efforts are made to shield children from witnessing or being aware of abuse, it must be incredibly difficult to protect them from the emotional consequences of abuse taking place within their home and being perpetrated and experienced by the most significant adults in their lives. And that's why I am particularly pleased to have an opportunity today to commend the work of the Cedar-Network. And may I add my own thanks to those already expressed in the Chamber this afternoon to all of those involved in the network. I'd also like to recognise the role of Scottish Women's Aid, who brought the Cedar model from Canada to Scotland and who managed the 3 pilot projects in Edinburgh, Falkirk and Fife. I think of particular merit is the way in which Cedar ensures that their programme of recovery for mothers and children are complementary and work in parallel. And this very much reflects Cedar's belief that mothers themselves are the best people to support children to come to terms with their experiences and to help them move forward into what is hopefully a life free from domestic abuse. Another commendable aspect of the Cedar model is the way it embraces partnership working, and I think this is true of our violence against women sector in Scotland across the board. I'm also pleased that we have had an opportunity this afternoon to explore young people's attitudes towards violence, and particularly the way in which violence is seen by young people through the lens of gender. We know that violence against women is rooted in gender inequality and the imbalance of power between men and women in our society. And Dr Nancy Lombard, who has written extensively on men's violence against women and on young people's attitudes to violence, was mentioned earlier, particularly by Sandra White. Dr Lombard's study examining the views of Scottish 11 and 12-year-olds documents some truly worrying views which demonstrate how perceptions about gender and violence remain deeply entrenched in our society. Perceptions that being a man legitimises the use of violence, that women and girls are the possessions of men, and that it's a man's right and entitlement to control and to regulate his partner's behaviour. Of course, this is not how the children themselves express these issues, but comments such as, because they're a couple, she should do what he says, or, well, she's been cheating on him, so she deserves it, highlight that those perceptions are very much alive in our society and that they begin at a very young age. So we must help young people growing up in Scotland today to challenge those perceptions and play their part in changing attitudes. But let's not be under any illusions. This is not an easy thing for a young person to do. It's not an easy thing for an adult to do either. Any action taken by a person that defies and distances them from their peers and perhaps even their friends takes tremendous courage. And that's why I'm pleased that the Scottish Government is supporting the Violence Reduction Unit to deliver the Mentors in Violence Prevention (MVP) programme in a number of Scottish high schools. MVP Scotland focuses on empowering young people to identify and to safely challenge and speak out against unacceptable behaviour. I've spoken about MVP in the Chamber previously, as have other members, so I won't go into the detail, but suffice to say that I think it is a fantastic programme. I'm delighted that the Scottish Government is funding and supporting a rollout of MVP Scotland to all state schools in Edinburgh and Inverclyde. Sandra White, in her opening speech, asked about the progress of the Violence Against Women strategy, and what I can reassure Sandra White is that it is, of course, progressing well, and the consultation is progressing. But I think it's important to also reassure members that many of the issues raised in tonight's debate, the wider issues, the issues of gender inequality and the imbalance of power which underlies domestic abuse, is of course part of the work that will be taken forward by the strategy. It's very important that it does so. But of course, there is a lot of work going on by the Scottish Government in tackling domestic abuse. The fact that Police Scotland, for example, has made tackling domestic abuse one of their 3 top priorities, I think sends out a very, very strong signal indeed. And of course, the fact that the criminal law is being strengthened in a number of ways over recent years, the fact that the Victims and Witnesses Bill will improve the support available to victims and witnesses throughout the justice system, putting victims' interests at the heart of ongoing improvements in itself is also important. And then, of course, the issue of corroboration as proposed in the Criminal Justice Scotland Bill is also an issue that has had the support of Scottish Women's Aid and a number of other organisations supporting women. So there is a lot of work being done, but there is obviously a lot more still to be done, and the Violence Against Women strategy gives us the opportunity to step up all of that work so that we can try to eradicate the scourge of domestic abuse from our society. I absolutely believe that across Scotland we all have a part to play in making our country one which is viewed around the world as an exemplar, not only for its determination to tackle violence against women, but also for what a nation can achieve by putting the pursuit of equality at its heart. So in closing, I'd like to join my fellow members in congratulating the Cedar project for its wonderful work, which I believe is playing a very valuable part in helping us towards this goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And that concludes James-Dornan's debate on the Cedar Network. And I now close this meeting of Parliament.